Between 1820 and 1880, approximately 50,000 Irish immigrants drained 700 miles of American swampland by hand. They worked with shovels, picks, grub hose, and slip scrapers. They worked in the Florida Everglades pre-drainage cuts, the Atchafalaya Basin, the Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina, the Black Swamp of Ohio, the New Jersey Pine Barrens, the Mississippi Delta levees. Their daily mortality from yellow fever, cholera, malaria, alligators, and snakes ran 5 to 15% annually in peak construction years. The land they drained is still being farmed today. 50,000 Irish immigrants, 700 miles of swamp drained by hand, 18 million acres of American agricultural land converted from wetland to dry farmland through their labor. The work happened across a 60-year span in some of the most physically dangerous working environments in 19th century America. The drainage labor was paid in pennies. The mortality rate was extraordinarily high. The workforce was largely anonymous. And the agricultural land that exists today across the American South, from southern Florida to the Mississippi Delta to the Ohio Valley, exists because of the work those 50,000 Irish immigrants did between 1820 and 1880. The drainage work was distributed across several distinct regional projects. The Dismal Swamp Canal in Virginia and North Carolina was the oldest sustained drainage operation in the United States. The Dismal Swamp Canal began in 1793 and continued in various phases until 1855. The canal was originally proposed by Patrick Henry and George Washington as a transportation route connecting Chesapeake Bay to Albemarle Sound. But the project also functioned as a major drainage operation, lowering the water table in the surrounding Dismal Swamp by several feet and opening adjacent land for agriculture. Irish immigrant labor on the Dismal Swamp Canal totaled approximately 5,000 workers across the six-decade construction period. Standard daily wage was 75 cents to $1. The Black Swamp drainage in northwestern Ohio was the second major regional drainage operation. The Black Swamp was an approximately 1,500 square mile wetland in the Maumee River Basin of northwestern Ohio, encompassing what is now Lucas, Wood, Henry, Defiance, Paulding, Putnam, Hancock, and Seneca counties. The Black Swamp had been a barrier to overland migration west of Lake Erie since colonial times. Beginning in the 1830s, the state of Ohio funded systematic drainage of the Black Swamp through a network of channels, ditches, and tile drains. The drainage work continued for 45 years, from 1830 to 1875. Approximately 8,000 Irish immigrant workers participated over that period, working primarily in the channel cutting and ditch excavation phases. By 1875, the Black Swamp had been effectively drained, and the former wetland had been converted to highly productive corn and soybean agricultural land. That land is still being farmed today and constitutes some of the most productive agricultural land in the Ohio Valley. The Atchafalaya Basin drainage in Louisiana was the third major regional project. The Atchafalaya River is a distributary of the Mississippi River, branching off near present-day Simsport, Louisiana, and flowing through approximately 300 miles of bottomland forest and swamp to the Gulf of Mexico. Beginning in the 1830s, Louisiana and federal engineers began constructing levees, channels, and drainage works to control flooding and to open the Atchafalaya Basin for agriculture and timber harvesting. The drainage work was particularly dangerous because of yellow fever, malaria, alligators, and snakes. Irish immigrant labor in the Atchafalaya Basin probably totaled approximately 12,000 workers across the 1830s through the 1870s. Yellow fever epidemics killed substantial numbers of these workers in clusters, with documented major epidemics in 1853, 1858, 1867, and 1873. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. The link is in the description below. Now we walk through the labor mechanics of the swamp drainage work itself. The fourth major regional drainage operation was the Dismal Swamp Canal in Virginia and North Carolina, which has the longest history of any American drainage project. The Dismal Swamp itself was originally an approximately 2,000 square mile freshwater wetland, covering parts of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. The swamp had been considered impassable by European colonial settlers since the 17th century, but its potential for agricultural land conversion was recognized by George Washington and other early American leaders. The Dismal Swamp Canal was originally proposed in 1790 as a transportation route connecting the Chesapeake Bay watershed to the Albemarle Sound watershed in North Carolina. Construction began in 1793 with primarily enslaved African American labor, supplemented by Irish immigrant workers from the 1820s onward. The canal was completed in 1850 after 57 years of intermittent construction. The combined drainage effect of the canal and the associated lateral ditching network drained approximately 50% of the original Dismal Swamp wetland, opening over 1 million acres to agriculture. The fifth and final major regional drainage operation was the New Jersey Pine Barrens drainage, which is less well known than the southern operations because the Pine Barrens were never fully drained and the original drainage projects of the 1830s through the 1870s were eventually abandoned. The New Jersey Pine Barrens cover approximately 1.1 million acres of coastal plain in southern New Jersey, characterized by sandy soils, low fertility, and extensive freshwater wetlands. Irish drainage workers participated in approximately 20 different drainage canal projects in the Pine Barrens between 1835 and 1875, totaling approximately 8,000 cumulative workers over the period. Most of the Pine Barrens drainage projects were eventually abandoned because the underlying sandy soil proved too infertile for sustained agriculture even after drainage. The Pine Barrens remained largely undeveloped through the 20th century and are now protected as the New Jersey Pinelands National Reserve. The relationship between Irish drainage workers and enslaved African American workers in the southern drainage projects is a particular historical complexity that deserves separate attention. In Louisiana and the Dismal Swamp region, drainage crews often included both Irish immigrant workers paid free wages and enslaved African American workers held as the property of the canal contractors. The two groups worked alongside each other in the same drainage channels, doing essentially identical work under essentially identical conditions, but with radically different legal and economic status. The Irish workers were free, paid in cash, and could theoretically leave the work at the end of their contracts. The enslaved African American workers were property, received no wages, and could not leave under any circumstances. The cumulative drainage labor produced by enslaved African American workers across the Dismal Swamp, Louisiana, Mississippi Delta, and southern coastal projects probably exceeded the cumulative Irish drainage labor by a substantial margin. The enslaved African American drainage work is its own historical subject and is not the focus of this video, but it should be acknowledged as part of the broader American drainage labor history alongside the Irish workforce. The standard drainage labor of the early 19th century used a combination of hand tools, animal power, and a few simple mechanical aids. The basic tool was the long-handled shovel, used by individual workers to excavate the drainage channel by removing soil one shovelful at a time. The pick was used to break up compacted clay or rooted soil that resisted shoveling. The grub hoe was a heavy hoe-like tool used to cut through tree roots and undergrowth that blocked the channel path. The slip scraper was a horse-drawn or ox-drawn earth-moving tool consisting of a wide steel bowl on runners, used to carry excavated soil from the channel to a disposal area along the channel bank. A single slip scraper team with 2 ox could move approximately 20 cubic yards of soil per day across moderate distances. The work was almost entirely manual. Steam-powered drainage pumps did not exist in commercial form until the 1870s, and steam-powered earth-moving equipment did not exist in volume until the 1880s. The Irish drainage workers of the 1820s through the 1870s did all of their earth moving by hand and animal power. A typical drainage crew of 50 workers could excavate approximately 100 to 200 feet of drainage channel per day, depending on the soil type, the channel depth, and the worker fitness. A 10-mile drainage channel might take a 50-man crew approximately 2 to 4 months of continuous work to complete. The hydrology of drainage work was conceptually simple but technically demanding. A drainage channel had to be cut to a depth and grade that would allow standing water from the surrounding swamp to flow into the channel and away from the work area. The channel had to slope continuously toward a discharge point, typically a river or a low-lying drainage outlet. The slope had to be steep enough to maintain flow, but not so steep that the channel would erode and silt up. Engineers surveyed the channel alignment with transit instruments and chain rods, marking the center line and the cut depth with wooden stakes at intervals along the route. The Irish work crews followed the engineering staking, digging the channel to the marked depths. If you are new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you do not miss the next video. We publish 2 videos per day this week. Now we walk through the disease and animal hazards that made drainage work so deadly for the Irish workforce. Yellow fever was the deadliest single hazard of southern drainage work. Yellow fever is a mosquito-borne viral infection that causes fever, jaundice, internal hemorrhage, and in severe cases, organ failure and death. The disease was endemic to the Gulf Coast region from colonial times through the early 20th century, with major epidemic years in 1853, 1858, 1867, and 1873. The yellow fever mortality rate in unvaccinated populations during an epidemic year could reach 20 to 50%. Drainage work was particularly dangerous for yellow fever transmission because the swampy work environment was ideal mosquito habitat, and the labor crews of 50 to 100 workers were close enough together that disease transmitted rapidly through the camp. The 1853 yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans killed approximately 8,000 people in the city and an estimated additional 3,000 in the surrounding drainage and levee construction camps. Cholera was the second major disease hazard. Cholera is a bacterial intestinal infection spread through contaminated water and food. The disease causes severe diarrhea, dehydration, and in untreated cases, death within hours of symptom onset. Cholera epidemics swept the United States in several major waves during the 19th century, including the 1832 epidemic, the 1849 epidemic, the 1866 epidemic, and the 1873 epidemic. Drainage camps were particularly vulnerable to cholera because the workers drank water from the same swampy environments they were draining, and the latrines and the drinking water sources were not adequately separated. Malaria was the third major disease hazard. Malaria is a mosquito-borne parasitic infection that causes recurring fever, anemia, and in chronic cases organ damage and death. Unlike yellow fever, which kills quickly in epidemic waves, malaria typically causes a chronic illness pattern with recurrent fever episodes over months or years. Drainage workers in the southern United States typically contracted malaria within weeks of arriving in a drainage camp and lived with chronic malaria for the rest of their working lives. The cumulative malaria mortality among Irish drainage workers across the 60-year span of the work probably exceeded the immediate yellow fever and cholera mortality. Although the malaria deaths happened later in the workers' lives, and were less obviously connected to the original drainage work. The animal hazards of drainage work included alligators in the southern swamps and various species of venomous snakes throughout the drainage regions. The American alligator was abundant in the Florida Everglades, the Atchafalaya Basin, the Dismal Swamp, and the various Gulf Coast wetlands. Adult alligators reach 12 to 14 feet in length and can take large mammalian prey, including humans. Drainage workers in alligator habitat experienced occasional attacks, with documented fatalities scattered through the historical record. Venomous snake species in drainage regions included the cottonmouth water moccasin, the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, the timber rattlesnake, and the copperhead. Snakebite mortality among drainage workers was significant, but probably accounted for fewer total deaths than disease. The total Irish drainage worker mortality across the 60-year span of the work is difficult to estimate precisely because individual deaths were not consolidated into national records before the late 19th century. The best estimate from labor historians studying the Catholic parish death registers across the major drainage regions puts the total at approximately 5,000 to 10,000 Irish drainage worker deaths over the period 1820 to 1880. The Catholic parishes in Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, Ohio, and Mississippi preserved approximately 8,000 individual worker names with death dates and causes of death. The remaining unrecorded deaths probably bring the total closer to 10,000, though the precise count cannot be reconstructed from surviving records. The Irish labor population for drainage work was recruited through a specific labor brokerage system that operated between Irish ports and the major American drainage regions. Labor brokers based in Cork, Galway, Dublin, and Liverpool advertised drainage work in the American press through Irish-language newspapers and through Catholic parish networks. Irish immigrants would sign 1-year or 2-year labor contracts before departing Ireland, with passage to the United States paid in advance by the labor broker and deducted from the workers' eventual American wages. The labor brokers consolidated workers in port cities including New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and New Orleans, then shipped them to the drainage work sites by train, riverboat, or coastal vessel. The labor brokerage system functioned essentially as a form of indentured servitude for the first year of each worker's American residence, with the workers tied to the specific drainage project that had paid for their passage. The wages for Irish drainage workers ranged from approximately 75 cents to $1 per day across the 60-year span, with somewhat higher wages in the 1870s when the labor surplus had moderated and somewhat lower wages in the 1840s and 1850s when the famine immigration wave had flooded the labor market. The wages were substantially lower than the wages paid to American-born laborers doing the same work. The wage differential was justified by the labor brokers and the drainage contractors on the grounds that the Irish workers had received passage to the United States in exchange for the lower wages, and that the workers were expected to work off the passage cost over the first year of their contract. The wage differential was real and substantial. The same drainage work that paid an American-born laborer $1.25 per day in the 1850s paid an Irish immigrant laborer 75 cents to 90 cents per day. The specific drainage tools used by the Irish workers deserve detailed description because they are essentially extinct as working construction implements today. The long-handled shovel used by the drainage crews was a particular design developed for wet soil excavation, with a slightly curved blade approximately 10 inches wide and 12 inches long, attached to a hardwood handle approximately 4 feet long. The shovel was designed for use while standing in water up to 2 feet deep, with the worker pushing the blade horizontally into the channel bottom and lifting the load up to a side bank. A skilled drainage shoveler could move approximately 3 to 5 cubic yards of soil per day, working in continuous repetitive motions for 10 hours per shift. The physical wear on shovel handles was substantial. A typical work shovel needed handle replacement every 6 to 8 weeks of continuous use. The Irish drainage workers often made their own replacement handles from local hardwoods during evening hours after shift completion. The grub hoe used by the drainage crews was a heavier tool than the standard agricultural hoe. The drainage grub hoe had a steel blade approximately 8 inches wide and 6 inches long, with the blade angled forward at approximately 45 degrees from the hardwood handle. The tool was designed to cut through tree roots, dense undergrowth, and compacted swamp peat that resisted shovel work. The grub hoe was swung overhead in long arcs that struck the ground with substantial force, cutting through whatever resistance was encountered. The work was even more physically demanding than shoveling, and crews using grub hoes typically worked shorter shifts of 6 to 8 hours rather than the standard 10-hour drainage shift. Grub hoe work was particularly dangerous because the tool could glance off hard objects and strike the worker's legs or feet, causing severe injuries. The Irish drainage workers learned through experience to wear heavy leather boots and to position their feet carefully when swinging grub hoes. The slip scraper was the largest mechanical aid available to the Irish drainage crews of the 19th century. A slip scraper consists of a wide steel bowl, approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, mounted on a set of low wooden runners that allow the bowl to slide across the ground. A team of oxen, typically 2 animals, was harnessed to the front of the slip scraper. The bowl had a steel cutting edge at the front that scraped soil up into the bowl as the team pulled it forward. When the bowl was full, the team turned 90 degrees to the disposal area along the channel bank. The bowl was tipped to dump its load, and the team returned to the channel for another scoop. A single slip scraper team could move approximately 20 cubic yards of soil per day across moderate distances, equivalent to the work of approximately 4 to 6 hand shovelers. The slip scrapers were heavily used on drainage projects where the soil conditions permitted ox team work, primarily in the Ohio Black Swamp and the Atlantic coastal plain drainage operations. The political and social treatment of the Irish drainage workers in the major drainage regions varied significantly. In Louisiana, the Irish workers were primarily Catholic, and the Catholic Church in Louisiana provided substantial social support, including church burial, family relief funds for widows and orphans, and political advocacy through Louisiana Catholic political networks. In Florida, the Irish workers were less well organized, and social support was less consistent. In Ohio, the Black Swamp drainage workers were largely Catholic, but the surrounding rural population was largely Protestant and German American, creating sometimes severe cultural tensions between the drainage workers and the established settlers. In Virginia and North Carolina, the dismal swamp drainage workers worked alongside enslaved African American laborers in mixed crews, with the Irish workers paid free wages and the African American workers held as the property of the canal contractors. The Catholic parish networks across the major drainage regions deserve specific description because they preserve much of the historical record of the Irish drainage workforce that the secular construction records did not. Catholic parishes in Norfolk, Virginia, Elizabeth City, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, Jacksonville, Florida, Mobile, Alabama, New Orleans, Louisiana, Toledo, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, and numerous smaller communities maintained death registers throughout the 19th century that recorded the burial of Irish immigrant workers killed in drainage operations. The parish records typically included the worker's name, age, place of birth in Ireland, date and cause of death, and where available the names of next of kin in Ireland or in the United States. Modern historical research drawing on these parish records has identified approximately 8,000 individual Irish drainage worker deaths by name, with full biographical information preserved for approximately 5,000 of them. The Hibernian Society, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and various other Irish-American fraternal organizations also preserved historical records of the drainage workforce. The Ancient Order of Hibernians, founded in New York City in 1836 as a mutual aid society for Irish-American workers, maintained chapter records in major Irish-American communities across the drainage regions. The chapter records included member rosters, death notices, family relief payments to widows and orphans, and burial assistance for workers who died without family in the United States. The cumulative records from the Hibernian Society chapters add approximately 3,000 additional Irish drainage worker identifications beyond the Catholic parish records, bringing the total documented worker identification to approximately 11,000 individuals. The relief funds maintained by Irish American organizations for widows and orphans of drainage workers represented a significant social welfare system within the Irish American community of the 19th century. A typical Hibernian Society chapter would maintain a relief fund of several $1,000s at any given time, with regular contributions from working members and distributions to families of deceased members. The relief payments were modest by modern standards, but sufficient to provide basic support for surviving family members until they could establish independent income. The cumulative relief payments made by Irish American organizations across the drainage regions between approximately 1840 and 1900 probably exceeded $2 million, equivalent to approximately $60 million today. The system represented a substantial private sector social welfare network that operated entirely within the Irish American community. Anyone who has seen the masonry on a 150-year-old drainage channel knows this. The Irish drainage labor of the 19th century was not just labor. It was a particular form of labor that converted American wetlands to American agricultural land at a cost in immigrant lives that the broader American historical memory has mostly not commemorated. The 18 million acres of converted agricultural land were the foundation of 19th century American agricultural expansion. The drainage labor was the price. 5,000 to 10,000 Irish workers died for those acres. The rest of the 50,000 survived and went on to become part of the broader Irish American population, with their descendants today numbering in the millions. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. The famine immigration wave of 1845 through 1852 brought an estimated 1.5 million Irish immigrants to the United States in 7 years. The famine was caused by a fungal blight that destroyed the potato crop across Ireland during those years, leading to mass starvation, disease, and forced emigration of approximately 1/4 of the Irish population. The famine immigrants who arrived in the United States faced a particularly desperate labor market, with most arriving without resources or English language skills, and with extreme physical weakness from the starvation conditions they had experienced in Ireland. The American drainage industry was one of the few employment sectors that would hire newly arrived famine immigrants in volume, because the work was physically demanding and dangerous enough that no other labor population would do it for the wages offered. The famine immigrants thus became disproportionately concentrated in drainage labor during the 1850s and 1860s. The mortality among famine immigrant drainage workers was particularly severe because the workers arrived already physically weakened from starvation and then immediately entered work environments with high disease exposure. A typical famine immigrant arriving in New Orleans or Baltimore in 1847 and entering Louisiana or Virginia drainage work would have faced a roughly 20 to 30% mortality rate over the first 3 years of American residence. The mortality was approximately twice the rate of the broader Irish American immigrant population of the same period. The high mortality reflected the combination of pre-arrival starvation effects, immediate exposure to American tropical diseases including yellow fever and malaria, and the physically demanding work conditions that did not allow time for physical recovery before continuing labor. The post-famine generation of Irish American drainage workers, recruited from the 1850s through the 1870s after the famine immigration wave had ended, faced somewhat better conditions but similar fundamental hazards. The labor recruitment continued through the standard labor broker system, with workers signing 1- or 2-year contracts before arriving in the United States. The wages remained low. The disease exposure remained high. The animal hazards remained dangerous. The total Irish drainage worker mortality continued at approximately 5 to 10% annually through the working period, dropping somewhat as quinine treatment for malaria became more widely available in the 1870s, and as quarantine and sanitation measures for yellow fever began to be applied in the 1880s. Approximately 8,000 documented Irish drainage worker names survive in Catholic parish death registers across Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, Ohio, Mississippi, and the other major drainage regions. The other 42,000 workers are mostly anonymous to the historical record. Their work converted 18 million acres of American swamp into farmland or grazing. The original channel cuts they dug between 1820 and 1880 are still draining American agricultural land today. Modern levee infrastructure across the South Atlantic and Gulf Coast still uses many of their original channels. The Black Swamp of Ohio is still farmed corn and soybean country, the legacy of the 8,000 Irish workers who drained it between 1830 and 1875. The Atchafalaya Basin still carries Mississippi River floodwaters along the channels the Irish workers cut. The Dismal Swamp Canal still operates as a recreational waterway, 230 years after construction began. The Irish workers who died of yellow fever, cholera, malaria, alligator attacks, and snake bites in the swamps are mostly buried in unmarked graves near the drainage sites. The land they drained is still feeding America. The records prove it.